So, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome all the brave souls who have come out here in the miserable weather. Well, it's good for the garden to be here in conversation with me and George Newhouse. And before we begin our formal proceedings here, I always want to acknowledge that we are here on the land of the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation. And we acknowledge, I think importantly, that over time, European settlement intentionally and consequentially displaced indigenous peoples from their land, disempowered them, and greatly destroyed their culture. And while they never ceded their sovereignty over the land. So we acknowledge that to heal the wounds of the First Nations of this land, we must empower their voice within the Australian Constitution, learn the truth of our intertwined history, and reach treaties to share equitably the bounty of this land. And one of the things that we'll end up being in conversation about is issues regarding the indigenous people of this land, the First Nations. And on one hand, it's great to acknowledge that the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, the roof body of all the Jewish organizations here in Australia, all the different boards of deputies, including the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies, which has also followed on, and our synagogue is a constituent of all those in endorsing the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And it's one of the major things in particular that this synagogue is working on to create those kinds of conversations and that kind of awareness. But we will hear that there is so much to be done along those issues. And we're going to get there in a man who, as we were saying just before, George and I have known each other for decades now. Yeah. Through his involvement in Jewish community and local politics, and then of course as well here in the synagogue, where both his son and daughter celebrated their being bar and bat mitzvah, and so there, and where he continues to be involved in his learning. And one of the things that I'm always curious about when we get someone who then over the last few years, it was like, I'm keep hearing George Newhouse in the news, and he's doing work that is so important. And how did that happen? Because Jewish people and Jewish men of our ilk and generation in particular are often encouraged to be good professionals and, go off on that trajectory. And when you get a young guy who, is going to Sydney Grammar, you can imagine he's being told, well, you can do this and you can achieve this. And it usually those things that are being talked about aren't, meaning you can lead the National Justice Project. It's a different kind of trajectory. And so what I'd like to first explore with you is what were those messages in your childhood, in your growing up, that influenced you not only to go into law on one hand, but also to have that sense of communal responsibility?
Well, thanks for that, Jeffrey. I suppose I came from a family where communal service was expected. My father and grandfather were both holders of multiple positions within the Jewish community. So my grandfather, Abe, in Brisbane was chair of the Board of Deputies, State Zionist Council, president of the Brisbane Hebrew Congregation, JNF, UAA, you name it, he headed it.
He covered the acronyms.
My father also, and some of you will know here in the audience, he was likewise on the board of the synagogue, president of the UAA, State Zionist Council, on the board of deputies. I don't think he was involved in the JNF as much as my grandfather. In fact, our commitment to Jewish causes is such that we tend to overcommit. My grandfather, may his soul rest in peace, died on a bus on the way home from a JNF meeting. That was how committed he was to causes. And my father was very active in the Jewish community until the day he died as well. So I think that community was, and giving to others was part of our DNA. My grandfather, after the war, went to Europe and the refugee camps and brought out many orphan children from the death camps. And, you know, until recently, I was still in touch with some of those. So it's something that's imbued in the family, but I also grew up with the history of growing up with my parents' friends who were Holocaust survivors and their children. And, you know, I think being Jewish, a sense of social justice was important to me. And also when I was reflecting about what I was going to say today, it also occurred to me that my Parsha, which is Shoftim, justice, justice shall you pursue, may have had some impact on me, but I suspect not, given the amount of attention I paid to studying for my bar mitzvah.
And so, you know, there comes this point that the former trajectory, you have all those communal influences, but the influence of grammar, UNSW law, and, you know, JP Morgan in New York, Clifford Chance in London. So you end up doing that, which is kind of the expected path of, as I said, a person of our education and our family upbringings and things like that. And what was it that made you leave the world of corporate law and, you know, all the success and kudos that brings?
Look, yeah, I think I did leave, you know, I did do all the dutiful things that a good Jewish boy does. You know, I did go to Sydney Grammar, and for that I was privileged. I had an education at the University of New South Wales, and then I went on to a career in corporate finance, both here and in New York, and then in London in law. I think the turning point for me, sadly, was the death of my father. I think that kind of freed me from, you know, trying to do all those things that one does to please a family.
And sometimes it's an interesting thing that one carries those expectations, even if they're not articulated, and perhaps not even what the parent fully deeply desires, but, you know, one internalizes it anyway. It's hard to know. You know?
I think so. But I mean, look, I was a good boy in that I went and, you know, did all the things that I was supposed to do, but I'm still dedicated to service to others. And I think that probably comes from the teachings of my family as well. So in some ways I'm still performing, but not just my parents, also my faith and the kahila and the community. For me, it's really important to feel part of a community. I came from a very small community in Brisbane, and I felt very connected. And a lot of people don't have that luxury to be connected deeply into a community and feel loved by a small community. So no, I think when I reflect on what I'm doing now and why I'm doing it, I think whilst it may not be because of what is in the Torah, although there's Tikkun Olam and there's tzedakah, I'm sure it comes from my connections to the community.
So when your father died, what was it that, as you say, you felt a little bit more free to move beyond perhaps those expectations? And what was it that took you off in this direction of really being a, you know, one who pursues justice as was planted within your parsha?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think what really triggered it was a Board of Deputies luncheon that I was invited to, where David Ma attended. David had written a book on CivX. I think you might have even been there, but certainly it was a Board of Deputies, a very interesting luncheon. And I was quite horrified about a number of things. Firstly, that I was unaware of the details of CivX and the children overboard and the lies that were told about parents throwing their children overboard, as if, you know, whoever was coming to this country was so evil that they would, you know, risk killing their children. But also that you know, that I had not done anything to educate myself or take any action in that area. I'd been involved in, I felt, communal service through local government, and I, you know, dedicated quite a lot of my life to local government, but really had not involved myself in refugee matters. And also, to some extent, I was a little taken aback by some of the fear that was expressed by the Jewish community leaders at that table about people coming to Australia, these people coming to Australia. And I thought, oh, I need to do more. And soon after that, I came to be involved in the case of Vivian Salon, a horrific case of a woman who was wrongfully deported, not just locked up. She was sent, she was an Australian citizen. I can't find another case like it in the world, who was wrongfully sent back to the Philippines and, you know, for 5 years. And what makes this case worse in many ways was, and I still feel the anger today, that her ex-husband and her children were looking for her. They thought that she had been murdered. There was a presentation on one of those shows where missing persons are displayed on television. Two of the public servants who deported Vivian saw that show, reported it to their superiors, and that file was hidden and shuffled around between Canberra and Southport for 2 years before she was found. They did nothing to bring her back, even though they knew they deported an Australian citizen. It wasn't until the case of Cornelia Rao became public that her ex-husband, and he's the hero in all this, he kept looking for her, rang up Amanda Vanstone's office and said, could my wife be in immigration detention? And all hell broke loose. And that case led me to this work. I was still, my dad was still alive, and I was doing work for the family of Vivian Salon on the side, but that I got a taste for that work that never left.
How did you get involved in the case of Vivian Salon?
It's a really interesting question. I had, you know, it literally happened, I think, 2 weeks after the David Marr lunch. So David Marr's responsible for my career, I think. And she had a brother in Brisbane. I had connections in Brisbane, and I reached out to the brother and said, look, and I also heard about the 2 children that were looking for their mother, because at this stage, they didn't know where she was, because part of the cruelty of the Australian government was they left a woman in a wheelchair. She was wheelchair bound at the airport in the Philippines. They did not make any arrangements for her to be looked after. This is our standard process when we deport people. You leave them at the airport. So they didn't know where she was. And actually, if it wasn't for Lateline being satellite, shown by a satellite into the wilds of the mountains in the Philippines, she would still be there today. There happened to be an Australian priest who was watching Lateline, and he said, that's Vivian. And by the way, that service has been sold off to Sky Television, and I do wonder whether she would be found today. But leaving that aside, I reached out to her brother. She was found. The brother rang me and said, we need help. I got together with the late Harry Friedman, who was a great colleague and compatriot, and the rest is history. I couldn't go. Harry actually flew to Manila to meet with Vivian and talk to her. But I really miss Harry and also Stephen Glass. They were great colleagues, and you know, I really miss them in this space. And Jewish community fighting for justice using the law as a tool.
And at that time, were you doing this work pro bono? Was that
Oh, yeah. Well, Harry, actually, yes, it was all pro bono. But whenever we get the opportunity to punish the government, we actually ask for costs. But our clients, Vivian wasn't able to pay a cent, nor should she. So yes.
Right. And then it was sometime after that that you ended up forming the National Justice Project.
Yes, I was fortunate to work with a fellow from America, Dan Mori. I don't know whether you might have heard of him. He acted for David Hicks. We were both brought in to work for Shine Lawyers in their pro bono section. They were about to float on the stock exchange, and they thought it would be a nice idea to set up a pro bono section. And Dan and I met there, and he's a wonderful man, and we're still friends today. And he's a board member of the National Justice Project. But after Shine Lawyers floated on the stock exchange, the accountants came in and they worked out that our section was not a profit-making section. One would have thought it was clear from pro bono, but they were very kind to us, and they allowed us some time to set up the National Justice Project, which is a charitable, not-for-profit legal service. But we do more than just law. We kind of, and I think this is Dan's influence, we brought a US style of strategic litigation to Australia. Dan had been schooled in the NAACP fights in America and the Southern Poverty Law Service, which are closely associated with universities in the United States. They don't really have legal aid as we do in this country. And it's a very different style of practicing human rights law. And I'm right, thanks. Dan brought that to the National Justice Project. We don't just do the law, we also do a lot of advocacy. The cases are often used to campaign for societal change or legislative change. And we also do a lot of education. One of our big focuses at the moment is training university students. We teach at Macquarie University, soon UTS, but Monash, Steve Caston teaches at Monash. And we're focusing on, in the future, on tech for justice, creating access to justice pathways through the use of technology. So it's not just law, and we're certainly not like legal aid. Our cases lead to change. I mean, the one that I can point to, well, apart from the refugee cases, but the kids off Nauru cases, we use novel tort law because we don't have human rights laws in our constitution. We had to rely on negligence and the duty of care to force the minister to provide urgently needed healthcare to children on Nauru. That led to all the children being taken off Nauru. But we then joined up with advocates like the AMA, the Australian Medical Association, Peter Costello's brothers. What's the charity? World Vision. World Vision got involved, and a number of others who were horrified about the treatment or the lack of medical care that people were receiving on Nauru. And that led to the Medivac laws being passed through one of your community members here, one of the members of the Shul, Karen Phelps. Now, we certainly don't take the glory for that, but the cases that we ran led to a narrative that led to campaigns that led to that change in the law. That's the way we like to operate.
Now, still though, of course, in the area of refugees, it seems like it's gone quiet. I mean, it's like the detention centers are kind of far away. The people who were there are there. We've stopped the boats. And so that's how we want to keep it, in terms of a narrative.
Yes.
And so what's the work that can be done now in that area of refugee law? What are the core areas of concern and advocacy?
Well, there's still a lot going on. There's still a lot of the Nauruan and Manus Island detainees are now in America, thank goodness. Although when they get there, look what they've arrived to, and a system that's not as, there's no social safety net there. So some of them are in some quite difficult situations over there. But there's a few hundred who are still offshore. There's thousands or so here in Australia who can't work, don't get government subsidies. I don't think they even get Medicare in some situations. So there's still an enormous cohort of need. There are tens of thousands of people who are still here on bridging visas and temporary protection visas whose lives are uncertain. So there's a lot of work still to do. And not just in law, but in the maintenance and support of these individuals through housing, through feeding people even, and medical services and dentistry. I was involved just recently in putting a group of dentists together with a group that desperately need dental hygiene. They haven't had any for 6 years. So that need is still there. And of course, we have to be concerned about what's going on around the world with refugees generally, but COVID seems to have led to a bit of a halt in movement of people around the world. And I think also the Syrian wars coming to some kind of end has really stopped the outflow. But there's still a lot more to do, and we're actively involved.
What would you like to see the Jewish community be doing on this front?
Well, I think I know that this community, in particular Emanuel Synagogue, are at the forefront of the work that's being done for refugees. I see some of those faces here today, but I also know that there are a lot of Jewish people who are not contributing and not doing and not supporting. As I said, through, there are a lot of organizations out there. Stephen Glass was involved in Refugee Action Centre. There are legal services. There's Marrickville. There's a Marrickville Centre that provides food packages, housing. I can give people lots of organizations that they can.
And you're right, we do have a social justice network here that does have a specific refugee arm to it or branch to it. And there are always projects to be done. And I feel, and perhaps you do too, that there was that narrative that the people who were coming here were a danger to themselves and therefore to us because they're bad people. And they're also using queue jumpers and illegal this. I remember a beautiful letter in the paper. It was, I think, to the Australian Jewish News, or it might have been to the Herald, I don't remember, but it was from Joachim Schneeweiss, and where he reminded the community that he was alive because of people smugglers who helped his family cross the border, as were many Jews who were able to survive the Shoah. You needed that intermediary, despite how despicable they are in the sense of taking advantage of people in need and desperation. So how do we help educate our community that, the people who are fleeing to be seeking asylum are genuine and,
It's a very difficult problem. And as I said, as I might have intimated earlier, one of the motivators that inspired me to do this work was the fear of the Jewish people at that lunch, which expressed itself in a very, negative way that, people were terrorists, that terrorists were coming to this country. Not one of the people I've ever met through the refugee process has been a terrorist. If you're a terrorist, you wouldn't come that way. It's just nonsense. But
it defies logic. In other words, when you have money behind you, why wouldn't you use a smuggled, forged passport and have a nice luxurious flight, into Australia?
But the problem is, Jewish people, like everyone else in the community, are influenced by our leaders, and there is a very strong narrative that people are queue jumpers and illegal, and even the language of the legislation is that they're illegal, which is nonsense. After the Holocaust, the Refugee Convention made it perfectly legal to seek asylum in any country, but we choose that language to demonize individuals, and we go along with it. Not everyone, but I think Australians a large number of Australians bought into that narrative.
Yeah. I think that's actually part of the issue. Maybe the Jewish community, we need to remind ourselves that the laws in the United Nations Convention are in a response to what happened to us in our strife, in our plight. And so it should help us be open to the newer generations that are in plight where they must flee for their life and for their safety. Now, somehow, as you were doing that work, you also, of course, became involved in another passion of this community with which we began the conversation in terms of the acknowledgement, which is doing work for First Nations communities, and as we have spoken, you and I, doing that in a way that is not seen to be paternalistic.
Yes, and I think as Jewish people, we do have a sympathy for those less fortunate or persecuted in our society. I do sense, as the generation that left Europe or fled Europe moves on in life, that there's less and less sympathy, but I suppose that's understandable. And I think there's an enormous amount. I know that I can see Ilona in the audience. I know that Shalom Gamarada is doing fantastic work. There are people in our community that are doing unbelievably good work, but I don't, and this is no criticism of anyone, but at a grassroots level, and in particular, more recently in the Black Lives Matter movement and rallies, I think that the Jewish community has been a little bit reticent to dive in and support individuals or the movement. And I think part of that comes from a narrative that's come from the United States, that they're somehow anti-Semitic or pro-Palestinian. The people I talk to in Australia wouldn't know where Palestine, well, they would not have an interest in that area, or at least they don't express it. It is not their main concern, which is survival. It is about having a voice. It is about being treated equally with equality in this country. And it troubles me that there's a political narrative being overlaid on top of First Nations issues that's scaring people off. And I do encourage the Jewish community to get involved with First Nations organizations and try and have some impact at that level. I think there really is a need, and even especially at a grassroots level. I look back at the people who inspired me, Jim Spiegelman, Freedom Rider, with Charlie Perkins in the 60s or 70s, 60s. Ron Caston with the Mabo case, proud Jews who were fighting side by side with Aboriginal communities. It's rare to see that kind of grassroots connection these days. I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all, and I'm not saying it doesn't exist at very important levels, but there are gaps, and I would encourage people in the Jewish community to get involved at that grassroots level.
No, I agree. It's an interesting thing. We always talk about William Cooper now, and how he was there at Kristallnacht to protest as an Aboriginal leader. And it's kind of like, I think it's time to have some Jewish leadership involved in the advocacy for not just the Uluru Statement for the Heart, but so many other issues that are there. Because I just came back from a little bit, of travel in outback New South Wales, and it was really more just a look-see because I'd never been out that way. And one of the things when I met a few Aboriginal people, it was like, there's a lot more that we need, that we're looking for, than just that statement, and it is some basic issues of justice, of employment, of health, of obviously education, and no more deaths in custody as well, which is, if we were going to look just at this last week,
that's right.
It's a shocker. And you would assume, you speak about Black Lives Matter, that outrage after George Floyd that, it launched the movement in a sense that had been growing in the United States into this international effort. And yet there's a parallel here with George Floyd, and speak about.
Well, David Dungay is one of our clients. We've been involved with David's family for 5 years, 6 years now since he died. And I think that family is truly distressed that although the coroner found that he died over a packet of biscuits, that they have not been able to find any justice or accountability for that death. No one has been held responsible for David Dungay's death. And he's just one of many in this country where an Aboriginal death goes unnoticed or without justice. And I do think that as members of the Jewish community, we're kind of sensitive to overt displays of racism or anti-Semitism, a swastika or a violent attack or a verbal attack. But I think we're less attuned to systemic racism. I don't know that we recognize that Aboriginal people are overrepresented in police harassment, the number of people who are stopped and searched by police, the number of children who are pulled over for not wearing a bicycle helmet. Aboriginal children are vastly overrepresented in that cohort. Why? If you go to Blacktown in particular, you'll see that kids are being over-policed and harassed, over-strip searched compared to comparable cohorts. I don't think we're intentionally blind, but we don't see it as easily. If someone was daubing a sign on an Aboriginal building, we might understand that because we see that in our own community. But Jews aren't picked on by police in this country. It's a very different feeling. And so I think we do have to educate ourselves more into the impact of systemic discrimination. One of the areas that we're involved in the National Justice Project is in healthcare. Now, my daughter's a nurse. I don't think doctors or nurses wake up in the morning wanting to harm people. I don't believe that at all. But there is systemic bias in our health system. We acted for the family of a beautiful, young, 26-year-old Aboriginal woman from Tumut. She was 6 months pregnant, and I know Walt's met the family. She was pigeonholed by staff as a drug user when she came 15 times pleading for help during her pregnancy. Now, she wasn't a drug user. She was sick and she needed to be referred to a specialist. She did not get specialist care. And on the last occasion, she went home and died of septicemia. Now, I don't believe, as I said, anyone intended to harm her, but that the coroner acknowledged in that case, for one of the first times in Australian judicial history, that unconscious bias had played a role in her death. And I think we do need to think about the impact of systemic bias and prejudice in the outcomes for First Nations people, but not just First Nations people. It's, you've got Ron Sackville leading an inquiry into the treatment of people with disabilities. It is shocking. It is shocking. And that bias also applies to them. It's probably a bit more overt in those situations, but it's definitely an issue.
And so let's go. Now we've mentioned the three things. So how did the refugee work lead to the First Nations, lead to the peoples with disabilities?
Okay. All right. Very quickly. I think the case of Vivian Solon and Cornelia Rao were my breakthrough cases into this area. One of the team members at the time had a partner who was making a documentary at Uluru about the community, the Mutijulu Aboriginal community. And they said, look, you've got to help this community. The government are trying to destroy the leadership of the community. And Mutijulu was one of the only Aboriginal communities that comes under the control of the federal government because it's in a national park. Every other Aboriginal community generally is serviced by state governments or territory governments. So it tended to be the experimental place where, in those days, it was the Howard government. Mal Brough was the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. They were testing out their strategies on how to treat Aboriginal communities. So in the middle of the night, they sacked the whole leadership of the Aboriginal community, alleging that they were harboring pedophiles. Now, I actually got threatened during this time by journalists because they said, look, if you take on this case, you are forever going to be associated with pedophiles. I thought, whoa, this is pretty serious. But the more I learned about it, the leadership of the community weren't involved in pedophilia. There was an allegation that one person they had left, they'd been thrown out. That person had actually worked for a government organisation, which I won't name. They weren't a local resident. But that was the cover that the government used to say, it's like saying we're going to sack Randwick Council because there's a pedophile in Randwick. It was just nonsense, but everyone bought into it. And it was very frightening to be at the forefront of that. But we ended up going to court and overturning that decision. We reinstated the board of the Mutijulu Aboriginal Association. But then 2 weeks after that, the minister called the intervention. And we were then involved with 73 Aboriginal communities in complaining about the intervention to the United Nations. So that was my introduction. I met the magnificent Professor Larissa Berendt at that time. We were both involved in putting the complaint together to the United Nations, and we've worked together ever since. And in fact, after 6 years, the National Justice Project has just co-located with Professor Berendt's organisation Jumbunna at UTS, and we're going to work in partnership on First Nations matters, because one of the very important issues for us as Jewish community members is that we need to work with First Nations organisations. I'm not a saviour. It's not my place to make decisions or tell people what they should or shouldn't do. We're working very hard to support First Nations organisations, train up the lawyers, First Nations lawyers of the future, to do the work that's sovereign-led by First Nations people. There's a great cohort of doctors and nurses and lawyers and professionals out there who are going to take to move this forward, but we will be there supporting them.
What are some of the active projects that you have going on now?
At the moment, well, I think there's two main areas. Deaths in custody, so the treatment of Aboriginal people in custody, police custody, youth detention, and prisons. And that experience has helped us help refugees in immigration detention as well. We've run cases to ensure that they kept their mobile phones in detention. Many of you will have seen that Billawheeler family who are on Christmas Island. Without the class action that we ran, those phones would have been taken away from them by the minister. We're also focused very much on the provision of culturally safe healthcare to First Nations people, both in the general health system, but most importantly in prisons. Prisons are a hotbed of people with disabilities, with medical needs. They are not getting properly serviced, and they're certainly not getting culturally safe care. And we're pushing for culturally safe care to be provided to all cultures in the community. It's something that's come from New Zealand, actually. Maori nurses pushed originally for culturally safe care in New Zealand, and that's moving over here to Australia. Finally, I think there's two areas that with resources we'll be moving into with Jumbunna. One is the shocking rate of child removal in Aboriginal communities. Another stolen generation, extremely high proportion of Aboriginal children are being taken from their families. And also people with disabilities. There's an intersection between health, disability, incarceration. Our jails, our youth detention centres are full of people with disabilities, with mental health challenges. So that's enough, I think.
And was it through the work with the Indigenous community that then led you, because some of these issues, as you say, deal with disabilities, that then led you into the broader work of disability?
Yes, definitely. There's an intersectionality in a lot of these situations between gender, race, disability, and the more, it was actually Miss Doo's case where we acted for the Deaths in Custody Watch Committee of Western Australia, where I really saw the health system at its worst. In that case, Miss Doo was treated inhumanely, shockingly by the police, but they took her to a hospital twice for assessment. And the doctors and nurses there were just as cruel and heartless, in my view, as the police. That's my opinion based on the evidence in the case. And the police got up in the witness box and were asked the question, do you think you behaved inhumanely to Ms. Doo? And most of them said yes. They admitted that they behaved inhumanely. But when I saw the doctors and nurses, they rounded the wagons and were extremely defensive about what they'd done. No, we did nothing wrong, nothing to see here. And yet they were prejudiced by a whole number of factors. I mean, it taught me a lot about unconscious bias. When a prisoner is brought into an emergency service, the prisoner is not the client, they don't treat them as the patient. This is what the psychologists gave evidence at the inquest about. The police become the client. Everything's done to look after the police. They are the worthy people and the prisoner is unworthy. And then if the police say she's faking it, the staff at the hospital take that on board, she's faking it. And that kind of prejudice ends up in death in her case. And it was just really interesting to see and learn about how unconscious bias can play its way into a death. But I think Miss Doo's death really did teach me that actually you can find unconscious bias and prejudice in all areas.
And in all people. And so that's something that, we have to deeply work on. So this, is just an overview then of a little introduction to George as a human being, an overview of the work of the National Justice Project. I know with the inclement weather, some people chose to Zoom in, and Marina, thank you for always making these conversations flow. Let us know if there's questions that now want to come through, but there is an esteemed group here. I am looking at a cohort of social justice, activists, and it's lovely to welcome each and all of you here. Want to broaden the conversation. Anybody who would like to ask George a question, either on a specific, here we go.
It doesn't surprise me. I mean, and you only have to look at America too, and the fact that it's acceptable in some circles to be a proud boy, it's frightening. Yes, I don't think that this has ever gone away.
Yeah. So one of the comments was that we recognize, and I'll put it into the context that the Jewish community had its eyes on Islamic terror in Australia for so long, and obviously there have been incidents. But in terms of the threat to the Jewish community at this time, it's definitely from growing far-right extremism. Okay. I'll repeat the questions because I understand that both people on Zoom and here aren't going to be able to hear.
Thanks so much. It's really disturbing times I find we've got now here. And I thought way back when the Tampa happened and when it seems so acceptable. The cruelty that's so normalized now is just so horrible. And when it's this is the ground on which fascism, Nazism grows. This population in this country is capable of allowing, it's not acting be supporting, but allow it. It's the bystander thing. It's and falling into the whole narrative. And what can we do to puncture that?
Okay, so the question following kind of on the comment of this growing, extremism, but that's falling on the back of a growing, almost like the frog that gets put into the pan that the pot that you just slowly up the boil, and the growing cruelty that is part of our society going back to Tampa days. The question was, what can be done about that, which is endemic to, allowing fascism even to happen?
I will answer that question, but before I do, I just want to note that in the audience, we have two of our Jewish members of the National Justice Project, Phil and Sophie. I won't embarrass them by giving their last names, but I'm really proud of the fact that we get a lot of Jewish volunteers.
There's another one who wants to meet you, who I will introduce you to after the program.
All right. But to answer your question, look, I look back fondly on the time of the Vietnamese boat people, when both parties in Australia, Liberal and Labor, were united on that policy. And until we see an end to this polarization of politics and extreme right-left kind of argument, I fear that you won't see relaxation in the cruelty. It seems acceptable to people on the extreme right to cause harm to individuals seeking asylum. I mean, I truly have seen 12-year-old girls, some younger, who've attempted suicide on Nauru, and because they've been put in such appalling situations. Now, whether you agree with the government or not about their policies on refugees, and I know there are many people who agree with them, why destroy a child's life? That it was just inhumane, And I agree with you that our society is prepared to tolerate a very high level of cruelty at the moment, and I don't see it abating until both sides of politics can calm things down. It's interesting to see the victory in Western Australia last night. I think McGowan is a centrist. I think a lot of people want to be in the centre, and they don't like what you've seen in the United States over the past 4 years. And I'm hoping that if we can see more and more of that, you might get to a bipartisan position. But without that, I fear the worst. Well,
I just want to get your response. On Thursday, we discovered in Parliament that New South Wales government is no longer publicly announcing Aboriginal deaths in custody.
I heard that.
No longer doing that. And we've now had 2 deaths in custody in the last month after a period of very low deaths in custody. And I recognize the government has made design changes in prison cells that are no hanging points. But
yes, that's right.
But they are no longer notifying publicly.
Yep. Well,
So George is going to comment on the fact that the government is New South Wales is no longer publicly acknowledging Aboriginal deaths in custody, and how does that play into the problem?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is the lack of transparency in governments. Governments are cutting back freedom of information requests. They're reducing the amount of information that they release to people and tell you about. If you recall, Scott Morrison, when he was immigration minister, stopped talking about interceptions of boats. They didn't want people to know. Deaths in custody, they don't want you to know. The less you know, the less you feel or see the cruelty, and not only that, the systemic violence that's being perpetrated in our names. And it is systemic, and it is acceptable in some circles, and it troubles me. It really does trouble me. You're not allowed to say that that will lead to fascism, because people say that's an extreme position. But I can tell you that what is going on in our name on Nauru and on Manus Island is it's torture. It's torture. And yet our government gets away with it. Sorry.
Because people can't see it. Yeah.
I was just wondering, my personal response is when I hear a story, first it's things like today, see at an artist and she's been stolen as well. And I was in tears and I think that is where the truth telling that organisations like the ABC sometimes need to do work. But how can we access those stories? Because they're the things I think that really get it come through.
So the question is from the child of someone whose mother was in the kinder transport, and having that personal experience, and recently having heard an Australian story of someone from who was part of the stolen generation, and the notion that, well, almost in a sense, you know, you can mention Manus, you can mention Nauru, you can mention stolen generation, and all these phrases or detention camps, but it's when you hear a personal story,
Yes,
and it just touches you so deeply. So how can more and more personal stories be explored, be shared?
that's a really interesting question. And once again, partially it's government shutting it down, partially it's privacy and the traumatization of the people involved. So as Phil and Sophie will tell you, we're very sensitive at the National Justice Project to re-traumatizing our clients. We see, literally, we have to get psychiatric care in our office regularly to ensure that the welfare of our staff, because we hear some of the worst stories. You don't hear them. You don't hear the ones about the 12-year-old girls or see them, because can you imagine what that would do for to their lives? And we can't risk re-traumatizing them. They are also scared that the government will take away their visas. Anyone that does want to talk is shut up because they're worried that the government will deport them. So there's a lot of stories out there that you don't hear. In relation to our First Nations clients, we will only assist them to speak about matters if they're up to it, and we warn them of all the impacts on their lives. It's quite traumatic to be telling your story. I know, for example, Itona Dungay, David Dungay's mother, she will not stop fighting until she gets some form of justice in this country. But there are others, you know, if you've lost your daughter or son or grandson, it's something, you know, we all know from our own communities that survivors spent decades before they would talk about what happened to them. Can you imagine what it would feel like to have that trawled over in public? So I agree with you that telling stories and narratives is vital, and it actually humanizes people so that you can see they're not the evil, illegal, they're actually human beings. But unfortunately, for a whole raft of reasons, you don't get to hear some of those stories.
I want to just share something. It's tangential but related. On March 3rd at the Australian Press Club in Canberra, Grace Kane, Australian of the Year, spoke. It relates to this, and I encourage everybody to find that address. It is, you will have tears in your eyes over the courage that it takes, and continued courage in 2021, especially what's going on,
yes,
on those levels, to speak out where often it's the perpetrator who is you know, protected and the victim who is not, and it relates to these kinds of issues as well. So March 3rd.
There's some question.
There's a question from Zoom. We're going to get that and then we'll come back.
Is there a question from that? And actually, there are two questions which are quite similar. Michael Falk, who's the chair of our social justice especially growing up First Nation there.
Okay, so from Michael Falk, who is the chair of our social justice work here at Emanuel Synagogue, and there's other members of the social justice team here today, asking what are some practical ground level actions that we can start doing along the First Nations program?
Well, thanks, Michael, for that question. I think a really important thing to do, and your committee does do it. You've brought in, I think, Thomas Mayer and others to talk about the Uluru Statement, which is a really important initiative. And the fact that this Kahila is getting behind it is great. I know Ilona's doing great things at Shalom Gamarada. I would like you to meet some of the families who've lost people in detention and in prison and in healthcare, and ask them what could be done. I'm not going to dictate or make suggestions. I think there's some amazing people in New South Wales. The mother of Wayne Morrison, who passed away and still does not know what happened to her son in prison. The guards are refusing to give evidence to the coroner in South Australia. They've appealed. He died 6 years ago. She still does not know what happened inside a prison van when 6 guards, we think, well, we don't know, did something to her son or nothing. We don't know. She's here in Sydney. I'm sure she would love to talk to you and other of our clients who've lost their loved ones in custody or in prisons or in healthcare. I think you should hear their voices and see what comes from that. I think you'll be surprised.
That's a great idea, and it relates to, Michal, your point, and therefore Marina, who organizes things on that level, extraordinary. I have an idea of where we could do perhaps like a Sunday late morning get together here and invite our community who would be interested to meet some people. So we'll speak about that. You know, Pesach is only a couple of weeks away, and you know, we talk about our Geulah, redemption from oppression, and the whole point of the Torah in my mind, and I think in yours then becomes to be working, you know, against oppression and for liberation of the most vulnerable.
Yes.
And clearly, you know, that's the work you're doing. So that we will start meeting people, and that's also the point of these things, is not just to have a talk fest, but to come up with ideas of what we can do next. I'll highlight just along those lines that our next 2 conversations, next one is going to be April 11th because of the period of Pesach. It's going to be with Julian Leeser and maybe someone else, where you haven't confirmed that, but to be talking about the work that has been happening in federal government along these lines. And the following one, which is the first Sunday of May, I believe it's the 5th, or the 2nd, thanks Marina, is going to be with Megan Davis. So that's going to be a very, very special treat to have her. And we're going to be talking about the Uluru Statement 4 years on, because it was in May of 2017, where to from here, because there's a lot of where to from here we got to do. So I just wanted to mention those things. You've been very patient.
Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Newhouse and Rabbi Kamins, my friend, Lily, told me about this, so I was lucky enough to be able to come along. We're part of my federal, I am part of refugee life, and I said we do a weekly demonstration at the town hall steps, 4:30 till about 7.
Yeah.
It's 7 because sometimes we join the Assange group, which is on the other side. It's another kettle of fish and something that we need to think about and do stuff on. But I was reading something from the refugee life map. It was from I was reading something from the Caldwell Centre, University of New South Wales, that scales fell from my eyes. What we need to do, I think, and people are saying it's being obsessive, talk about it all the time. What we need, not only do what we need to do is we want, when I was growing up in London, you kick the ball over the fence, you went to the Navy, you said, "Can I have my ball back?" What we need to do, we need to get our refugee convention back, really and truly. It was signed in 1954 by Australia under Menzies. Howard comes along, he punches the ball, he takes it out of the Migration Act. he takes Australia out of Australia. We have been, I won't be crude, but we have been, I can't think of the right word. You can imagine.
Yes.
We have been taken to the cleaners on this one. We need it back. We not only need that, we need a human rights act as well. Because
Yes.
even when you have the,
yes,
in my opinion, even when you get the, if we could get the refugee convention back, you could still have ASIO locking people up for 11 years, which you've got at the moment, 2 people, Rajana and Arash Ranana.
Yeah.
So you need those 2 things.
Okay, so
first of all, and that's what I think the next campaign should and must be, not saying how poor, that some refugees are really nice people, not saying how much they've suffered,
yeah.
but we want our refugee back, and what have you done with it?
So Stephen's taking the question about refugees to the, in a sense, the next level, the whole
Yeah.
policy and governmental action.
Yes.
And the fact that we punched a hole in the refugee convention, Australia's
Yep.
commitment to it, how to get that back into government policy, and then working towards a human rights act in Australia. So
All right.
do you want to?
Yeah, I teach this, and it actually is something I'm very embarrassed about. I don't know whether you know, but there is a reason why Australia does not have any human rights in its constitution. And I don't think we get taught this, but at the time of the Constitutional Convention in the 1860s, there was a big issue, and it was Chinese immigration because of the gold rush. And the Tasmanians came up with a draft of the Constitution that included equality before the law and due process. 2 states said, no way we're going to have a Bill of Rights or human rights in our Constitution because of the impact on their racist laws on the goldfields. And it shocks me to my core to realize that one of the leaders of that campaign was Sir Isaac Isaacs. And he led the campaign to vote down the Bill of Rights. And it's Victoria and Western Australia. Now, Western Australia, I understand, it's still a frontier state. But Victoria led the charge against human rights in our Constitution, which really shocks me to this day. And Isaac Isaacs, of all people. But there you are. So to answer your question, you won't get change when you have a polarized legal system, political system. You need a leader. You know, there are people in the Labor Party who would excoriate me for saying this, but like Malcolm Fraser, who was able to accept the importance of the Refugee Convention and allow Vietnamese to come into this country. Until you see that kind of heart again on one side, on both sides of politics, I fear that you won't get that reform, and you certainly won't get a Bill of Rights. It was actually, I don't want to embarrass Walt, but his ex-boss, who I think really sunk the Bill of Rights, a Bill of Rights in Australia under the, I think it was under the Rudd government. They ran a campaign for a Bill of Rights, but it was Labor in New South Wales who were against it. So I fear that we won't, and unfortunately, we rely on the kindness of our politicians for the human rights that we receive. And if we have a government in power that does not respect human rights, there's very little in our Constitution that will stop them. And, you know, people come and say to me, well, why can't you stop what's going on in Nauru or Manus with the Constitution? There's nothing in the Constitution to help us. Nothing. In fact, the Constitution is designed to be racist. We are the only country with a modern Constitution that has a racist power, all because of Chinese immigration at the time of the gold rushes. So we had to use tort law, negligence, you know, ambulance chaser law. And I say that, I don't consider myself to be an ambulance chaser, but that's what people think of tort law, to actually save the lives of children on Nauru. That's what we were left with. But I really do hope that Australians will find a heart, they will demand that our governments reinstate the sections of the Migration Act that were taken out, and that they do protect people in need.
Thank you. 1, 2, and
You're
3, just so people will be patient, then we'll take it from there.
2 points. One, the question you made about how you deal with traumatized people and those stories out publicly. And
Yes.
so on. And it strikes me that there was a model in the Royal Commission on Child Abuse.
Yes.
Because it was a very heavy investment with sufficient time. There was a personalised connection with the story, but yet the story still came out.
Yes.
That in, I would have thought that at least there's a model that can.
Yes. Oh, yes. Sorry, go on.
The second thing was, in terms of story truth-telling, Victoria has, I think,
Through your process.
Yes. Yes.
A truth-telling book, something I just wondered what your thoughts were about it, and it was set up properly.
Ooh.
The story.
I think, yeah, no, that's great. I think it's a really important step for the truth to be told in public through a government commission that will have some standing and credibility. We live in a time of fake news where, you know, people are able to bury stories, deny them. You know, I think even under the Howard government, they denied the stolen generation. They weren't going to live by a black armband view of politics. Get the truth out there, do it in that structure. I can't vouch for it being appropriate because I haven't studied how they've set it up, but having a government structure really will help. I know that it helped a lot of people because I was involved in the Royal Commission in relating to child abuse, but I can tell you that they had wraparound services to help individuals who were coming out with extremely traumatic stories. They had psychiatrists, they had free legal services. I'm talking about the few clients we have without those resources, and we do the best we can to protect our clients. But I think that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Victoria is very important. It's important for us to hear the history, the colonial history of Australia, and as Jews to be sympathetic to that. It's really interesting, when I was preparing for today, I found a quote by Theodore Herzl. I thought, you know, there might be some people who don't agree with me. Herzl said in Alt Neuland that the Jewish people would understand the plight. He said something like, only the Jewish people could truly understand the plight of Black people in the United States. Even then, I thought it was really interesting that Herzl could understand that situation and saw that the Jewish people's connection to people, Black people in America. I think he didn't use that word, but there you are. Yes, thank you, Marina. I found that. And I was really interested to read it. But yes, I think truth-telling is very important. And that's part of the Makarrata process too, that's going forward, which I'm a strong supporter of too. I think things can be done at a high level and also at a grassroots level. And I think that Jewish engagement should be at the high level. You'll hear Julian Leeser, who is a great supporter of this process, I think. And if he's not, I think he is. But also work at grassroots level and talk to people who've suffered and demand change at that level as well. Yeah. Criminal responsibility. Yes.
So Jen's question is in terms of legal change or change to law,
yep.
And a very good example, you know, the age of criminal responsibility and things like that. Is there work that you do?
Yeah. Yes, we're very active in that area. We support the raising of the age of criminal responsibility. It's shocking that a 10-year-old can be held criminally responsible for an act. But we've had some successes, particularly in Western Australia. Miss Doo's case saw a number of profound reforms. We saw an Aboriginal custody notification scheme introduced that saves lives. If an Aboriginal person is arrested in Western Australia, the Aboriginal Legal Service has to be notified. That was a powerful reform. An even more powerful reform was they changed the law on fine defaulters. The fine default laws criminalize poverty. Magistrates give a fine to keep you out of jail. But in Western Australia, they were locking up people who didn't pay their fines. Well, if you're poor, you can't pay your fine. And the fines were often unrepresentative, or you know, they were standardized, but didn't take into account people's income. So we saw that law changed. And this is not us, but the work like ours, in Victoria, the Tanya Day inquest saw changes in the alcohol laws that criminalize alcoholism, right? And we're also still working on laws that criminalize mental illness. So you have laws that, criminal laws that penalize disorderly conduct. Well, who do you think is disorderly? Someone with a disordered mind is often disorderly. So what we often do is criminalize mental illness. And that's also what you see. Our jails are full of people with mental illness. So we are very strong on reform. We often team up with other organizations to do that work. You're stronger with more people, but we're definitely in that. We've made a number of submissions to the New South Wales Upper House recently on Black Lives Matter. They had an inquiry. I think there might even be some reform of the coroner's processes in New South Wales as a result of that. Did you ever? Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Didn't think that I would survive in the country with a single time, but we did, and it's where I am. So I think there's a positive to come out as much.
Sure.
As someone who's new to the community, that much knowledge is on the convert. I think a lot of people want to do and to get involved, but don't know how. So kind of
Wow.
like how sort of volunteering, because I'm quite sure there's so many people that would love to help, to get engaged and don't know how.
So George, earlier I said when you introduced
Phil and Sophie. Phil and Sophie.
Oh, there you are. So the lights in my that I said there's one other person I know who wants to volunteer. So Mara has just spoken. As someone who came by boat, refugee with her mom, a single mom, from Indonesia to Curtin, and has managed to not only survive the boat ride, survive the detention, and survive what it is then to grow up in the challenging circumstances here in Australia, to be highly educated, someone who wants to make a difference, and says to remember that there are positive stories that still can come out of these negative, horrible circumstances, and to shift partly the focus not just on the government, but also to people like her who wants to volunteer. So Mara, I introduce you to George, Mara, and you'll be able to speak afterwards. And if there's anybody else out there on Zoom who wants to get involved in the work specifically of the National Justice Project, you'll be able to go online or speak to George. And at the same time, also through the work of Emanuel Synagogue with Michael Falk in the leadership role of that, but you can simply write any one of us here. I know my email box is, Marina, can it come to you?
Yes.
Marina, like, you know, a marina, but Marina, M-A-R-I-N-A, @emmanuel.org.au. If you want to do social justice work through here. And also we will organize, you know, a Sunday
meetup.
brunch to get to
I think that'll be good.
people and hear voices, to hear stories, and know how better to respond and how better to get involved, whether it's on the higher level that some, you know, many people in Jewish community do, that, you know, governmental advocacy, or on the grassroots, human to human level. Jen.
I want to say this, if you wanted to hear sort of first-hand stories, there's a wonderful Indigenous young women's choir. Their record, their CD is called Spinning Hex Gun.
Ah, yes.
We're thinking of even, I'm trying to think of how we can get them to come.
I
here.
know Spinifex.
Okay, see here.
We sort of know them too, so maybe together we could. So there's a song that was do on that record.
Yes.
There's the most sort of heartbreaking scenarios and stories, but in beautiful exquisite music. And to buy the CD will give money to further these young women's careers.
Can I say thank you, Mara, for your comments? There are many positive stories. I mean, just surviving in this country after what people have been through is, you know, a gift to our nation. And I don't want to just focus on the negative, although that tends to be where we work. But I will talk to you after, and we do need your help. Are you a Farsi speaker? No. What language do you speak? Wow. So you're Yazidi. Okay. But thank you for reminding us of that. And I can tell you that this community is blessed to have you, and I'm part of it too. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks, George. And are there any other questions or comments from people here? Yeah. Well.
Can I get a second vote, George? George, are you doing any work involving? I know this is even controversial.
Yeah.
My view on this, on female incarceration in general.
Yeah.
Very few women in prison should actually be in prison, other than women who commit murder. And those who commit murder are usually killing someone who's been habitually violent against them.
Yes.
So, and I just think that one of the major areas of reform that we actually need is, I know this is really controversial, reducing the number of female prisons in New South Wales.
Shouldn't be controversial.
Well, it is, but
I know. Thank you for that question. I don't have the constraints that you have to work under, but
the question was how to reduce the shameful rate of female incarceration. Point one, there's rare reason for a woman to be incarcerated, you know, other than for murder. And point two, and within that, many women convicted of murder are actually responding to years of horrific abuse.
Yes, yeah. I think it's a critical issue in our society. We tend to look at it through the frame of First Nations women. They are overrepresented. So what you've seen over the last, I don't know, decade is a rise in the incarceration of women, but it's been an exponential rise in the rate of incarceration of First Nations women. In particular, once again, we focus on WA. There is an incredibly high rate of incarceration. And what's also discriminatory, well, is that the women get less services than the men. So the services in prison are pretty hopeless. But in order to get out, to get parole, you've got to do courses, you've got to study, you've got to deal with your psychological problems or drug addictions, if that's what the issue is. In order to do that, you need courses. They offer them to male prisons, but not women's prisons in WA, or at least a very restricted service. So you can't get out. And they say, oh, well, that's because we've got more men, there's not enough demand. Well, they're increasing the demand by locking people up, but they're still not providing the services. So this is something, yes, that is on our radar. And thank you for raising it, because I don't talk about it enough. And we do need law reform. Women, look, I'm against all forms of incarceration, particularly of young people. And you talked earlier about raising the age. Young people need help. They should be diverted away from the criminal justice system. That's what 30 years ago, this is the anniversary, 30 years ago, the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody said their biggest recommendation was divert kids away. Instead, we have police who hassle kids because they're not wearing a helmet, Aboriginal kids. If you're not Indigenous, you can ride your bike without a helmet and not get arrested or hassled by police. So it is a big problem. We need to address mental health. A lot of people who are in jails and detentions have mental health issues. That's one way of getting the number of people down. And I really commend you for raising that. Thanks, Walt.
So we're dealing with issues of race and also of gender. There was
and disability.
One of yours was slides was about white male privilege.
Yes.
Do you want to?
Have you been scrolling
it
through
hasn't
them?
been up there, but yeah. But when you mentioned Altnoy land, she put it up there.
Well, look, privilege is a big issue these days, and it becomes. No, it's back.
It's backwards. Yeah.
It's got the. That's some of our cases. Ron Caston. No, I don't know what happened. But sorry. But white privilege is like we take for granted that we live in the eastern suburbs and the police here don't harass us for not wearing a bike helmet like they would if you're in Blacktown. Let me tell you, if you're in Blacktown, your kids would be, and they were Aboriginal, would be having interactions with the police regularly. We are privileged. We get a different education, we get different health services, and we tend to take them for granted. And males do it. You know, there's male white privilege, there's male privilege over women. You look at the glass ceilings that women suffer from. And I just think that we should all be trying to remind people of the privileges that we have and try and understand how it might feel from the other person's perspective. I think that's all I was going to say. Okay,
and I'll just, and it does raise a whole other kettle of fish that relates to Walt's question. There's so much in the law that does need to happen for women's rights and women's justice, not just in incarceration, but as we see in the whole incidents right now, just in terms of sexual, not just sexual abuse, but sexual assault and all these things. The criminality of the system is weighted to protect the perpetrator, and it's a major issue that I'm sure will come on your work's scene. In terms of privilege, I'm white, I'm male, I'm also heterosexual. And even as a Jew, which you could say, oh, that's my one, not in the eastern suburbs,
yeah,
and not in Australia. And so that's why I do what I do. I feel that I more talk the talk, and it's always an honor and a privilege to have someone who's out there actually walking the walk. You have our fullness of support. We're really very, very grateful that you are actually as well a member of this Kehillah. It shows the connection between the work we're trying to engender out there. So everyone who is here present with us today, everyone who is warm in your homes on Zoom, thank you for participating. Thank you for listening. And even more, thank you in advance for getting involved to continue to come to the conversations ahead. You can hear they're going to be focusing on First Nations issues, and we'll be doing some of that work here. But there's going to be a lot more to be done in terms of refugees, people with disabilities, working for gender equality, and so on and so forth. Tzedek Tirdov, it was your parsha. It is, the references to justice in the sanctuary are evident. It's what Judaism is about, with loving kindness, which we spoke about being such an important part of taking our country to, and with humility as well. So with those thoughts, I want to give a big round of thanks to George for being here, for the work you do.
Thank you.